All right, we're back for the next chapter of A Year Down Yonder, titled Hearts and Flower. After several weeks of hard winter, this end of the county is enjoying a January thaw. Mrs. Dowdle, a lifelong resident, observes that a January fog will kill a hog. Newsy notes from our communities. The Piatt County Call. There's a little quotation from their local newspaper. We just finished up a Saturday breakfast when we heard a pecking of sharp heels out on the back porch. Grandma looked up. A shape showed in the steamy window of the back door. There came a fumbled knocking. "Better let her in," Grandma said. It was Mrs. L.J. Widen Bock, the banker's wife. Fools rush in, and she plunged past me into the kitchen. Grandma looked her up and down. Mrs. Widen Bock's hat spilled black artificial cherries off the brim. Her upper arm clamped a big pocketbook, and her coat featured a stand-up muskrat collar. Grandma considered the fur with a professional eye. Speaking of fur. Her gaze fell to Mrs. Weidenbach's hemline, though she had to peer around the table to see. This may have been when Grandma saw that skirts were getting shorter. Mrs. Weidenbach showed a good deal of leg. "I won't keep you, Mrs. Dowdle," she sang out, "as I see you are a busy woman." Having polished off a plate of scrapple and corn syrup, Grandma lolled. "I will cut the cackle," Mrs. Weidenbach said, "and come straight to the point." Mrs. Weidenbach never came straight to the point. Her voice dropped. "Word will have reached you about poor Mrs. Votsmeyer over at Beemit." "Will it?" Grandma said. Mrs. Weidenbach clutched a chair back and leaned near. "The change," she said. "If she's thinking about making a change, who could blame her?" said Grandma. "Votsmeyer's no prize." Mrs. Weidenbach rested her eyes. "I mean the change of life." She tried not to notice me nearby. "Hitting her hard, is it?" Grandma inquired without interest. Mrs. Weidenbach clutched her own furry chest and reeled. "The night sweats, the hot flashes, of course it's nothing to what I suffered, but—" Still I wouldn't go away. I was just off her elbow, hearing every forbidden word, and she was coming to the best part. Her voice fell, and her womb dropped. "Do tell," Grandma said. "How far?" "She says it feels like it hit the floor. Mrs. Weidenbach gave me a cold shoulder because I was sticking like Grandma's glue. But, as you know, I never gossip." Grandma lurched in surprise. Coffee jumped out of her cup. "All I'm saying is Mrs. Votsmeyer is out of the running." A dreadful vision of Mrs. Votsmeyer trying to run with some of her insides bouncing on the floor almost sent me reeling. "And so we are up a gum stump about our Washington's birthday tea. It's our sacred tradition to serve cherry tarts to honor General Washington, and as the world knows, there is nobody to touch Mrs. Votsmeyer for her cherry tarts." Mrs. Weidenbach's eyes snapped. "She is a plain woman, but there is poetry in her pastry." "Who's throwing the party?" Grandma said. "Who?" Mrs. Weidenbach blinked. "Why, the DAR, of course, the Daughters of the American Revolution, of which I have the honor to be president." The DAR was a club of only the best ladies in town. They all traced their families back to the Revolutionary War, our side. "As I expect you are aware," Mrs. Weidenbach said, warming up, "my family descends from Captain Crow, who was at Yorktown when Cornwallis capitulated. My mother was a Crow, you know." "Ah," Grandma muttered, "that explains it." "Frankly, Mrs. Dowdle, one of the sorrows of my marriage is that I don't have a daughter, and yes, a granddaughter who will step into my DAR shoes when the time comes." I couldn't help it. I looked down at her shoes. They were high-heeled and a size too small. Mrs. Weidenbach looked at me bleakly. After all, she had no granddaughter, and Grandma had me. Now she began her retreat because the January thaw hadn't thawed Grandma. "I'll leave you with this thought, Mrs. Dowdle. The Daughters of the American Revolution maintain a proud tradition of American aristocracy, in even as humble a town as our own. Without cherry tarts, we are letting down General Washington. The town is still abuzz about your pumpkin and pecan pies, and I bow to nobody in my admiration for your flaky pastry. I charge you, Mrs. Dowdle, to play your part and come through for us." With that, she was gone. We listened to her pecking off the porch. Silence fell like a benediction. Grandma took her sweet time and then remarked, "Skimpy coat, wasn't it? She's courting pneumonia going around naked on the knee. She wasn't wearing enough to pad a crutch." We sat at the table listening to the icicles drip from the eaves. Finally, I said, "Grandma, are we going to be making cherry tarts for her?" Because we'd need cornstarch and we were about out of lard. But she didn't hear me. "There's different kinds of people in the world," she said. "There's them who'll invite you to join their bunch. Then there's them who will pay you for your work. Then there's Wilhelmina Widen Bock." And that seemed to be her final word on the subject. Another note from the newspaper. Winter resumes its grip as the younger set at the high school looks forward to an exchange of Valentine cards, and the DAR is abuzz about its annual Washington's birthday tea. The high school will have its big red hearts, but where will the DAR get its cherry tarts? Newsy notes from our communities, the Piatt County Call. "What's all this about a Valentine exchange?" Carlene Lovejoy said to Irene Stemple one February morning. "Nobody told me about it." Newsy notes may have been optimistic. There were a lot more girls than boys in school, and none of the boys seemed to be of a romantic nature. Ina Ray leaned over from her desk and pushed her big-eyed little face into mine. Somehow, she still looked scrawny and incomplete without her wings. "It says in the paper there's going to be a Valentine exchange," she whispered. "At the grade school, we always made our Valentines. We cut out hearts at our desk and put on lace. Elmo Leaper ate the paste. It was fun. Do you reckon we'll make them here?" "I doubt it," I whispered back. "This is high school." "Well, beats what we're doing." Ina Ray stuck out her tongue at her history book. The classroom door opened. Principal Fluke stood there with a new boy. The day had been gray, but crisp winter's sun broke through and seemed to find the newcomer. He was as tall as Mr. Fluke, and lots better looking. His hair was red gold, according to the sun, and not cut at home. It was razor-trimmed over the ears, flat to his head. Forrest Pugh Jr.'s ears stood straight out, like open car doors. "Miss Butler," Mr. Fluke said, "I got you a new scholar. Looks like my prayers is answered, and I got me a scoring center for my basketball team." Mr. Fluke pointed to the top of the boy's head. Milton Gritter flipped his pencil and slumped at his desk. At 5'9", he'd been the tallest boy in school. Till now. The new boy seemed to be 6 feet tall, easy. The back of Carlene Lovejoy's head vibrated. "Name of Royce McNabb," Mr. Fluke said. His paws come in as surveyor for the county roads. Families come from down Coles County way. Mattoon. Let's call him a senior. If Royce McNabb minded hearing his personal history blurted out in front of strangers, he didn't let on. But then, he was from Mattoon, which was cityfied for these parts. And sure enough, he was wearing corduroy pants, not overalls. An argyle patterned sweater strained across his broad shoulders. Ahead of me, Carlene gripped herself. "Be still, my heart," she murmured loudly. Then she leaned across to Irene Stemple and said, "Hands off, he's mine." "Move over, Milton," Miss Butler said, "and make Royce welcome." Royce went through the day with the same smile for everybody. He'd probably been in a lot of schools and knew how to handle himself. When I got home, I told Grandma we had a new boy at school. She waved him away. That town's filling up with people you wouldn't know from Adams off Ox. Not like the old days when you knew your neighbors. The winters were colder back then, too, weren't they, Grandma? "People starved to death because their jaws froze shut," she said. "You getting interested in boys?" "Who, me?" I said. At that, we heard Mrs. L.J. Weidenbach fumbling at the back door. When I let her in, there were icicles in her muskrat. She elbowed past me, her eyes teary with cold and emotion. Grandma had been over by the Hoosier cabinet. Now she was sitting down, seemingly at her ease. "Mrs. Dowdle, we cannot pussyfoot any more about these cherry tarts," Mrs. Weidenbach grappled with her giant purse and came up with the Piatt County Call newspaper. I need a commitment. My land, it's in the paper now, and where it was inspired 2 lines of bad verse. Grandma didn't read the paper, so Mrs. Weidenbach shook it open and read. The high school will have its big red hearts, but where will the DAR get its cherry tarts? Doesn't that just turn your stomach? She demanded. I don't call it reporting, and I don't call it poetry. It's snooping, and possibly by a foreign power. The dignity of the DAR is on the line. Grandma picked a loose thread from her apron front. Mrs. Dowdle, I need your answer before we get any more publicity of this sort. Oh, well. Grandma turned over a large hand on a oilcloth. If it's my patriotic duty, I'll bake up a mess of tarts. The wind went out of Mrs. Weidenbach. She'd been geared up for a large struggle, more on the lines of the Battle of Bunker Hill. You will? Well, that's real reasonable of you. All in a good cause, Grandma said. Mrs. Weidenbach turned to go, but didn't make it to the door. On my terms, Grandma said. Mrs. Weidenbach turned back slowly. Well, you have your DART right here at my house, but it'll be handier for me, Grandma said. I don't get out much anymore. That was a whopper, but Mrs. Weidenbach's head was swirling. Mrs. Dowdle, let me explain. This is more than a social occasion. This is a meeting of our DAR chapter, strictly limited to our members. It's always at my house. I'll fire up the stove in my front room, Grandma said. It'll be warm as toast in there. Or you can serve store-bought cupcakes at your place. Mrs. Weidenbach crumbled. I was at school early on Valentine's Day, but Miss Butler was there before me. Since the newspaper had an announced Valentine exchange, she thought she'd better fill in with a Valentine of her own on everybody's desk. Hers were the flimsy kind that came in a sheet you punched out, so that was 1 Valentine apiece. When people straggled in, they found their Valentines. Honestly, Carlene Lovejoy said, rolling her eyes when she saw her Valentine from Miss Butler. She stuffed it into her desk. Then here came Ina Ray. On her desk, beside mine, was Miss Butler's Valentine and 3 more. Ina Ray clasped both hands over her mouth. She squeaked, and people turned to look. She was all eyes, and she really was the thinnest girl in the world. She was skinnier than a toothpick with termites. She looked around to see how many Valentines everybody else got. 1 apiece. Ina Ray crept into her desk. Her hands dithered over the paper pile. She, too, made short work of Miss Butler's Valentine. Then she took up the next one. It was homemade to a fault. It looked like it had been whittled, not cut out. The message read, I send this sentiment in haste, but at least I didn't eat the paste. A secret admirer. Ina Ray stared, then leaned so far over she almost fell in my lap. I think this one's from Elmo Leaper, she confided at the top of her voice. Can you believe it? And really, I couldn't. Ina Ray sat straighter in her desk now. Maturely, she took up the next Valentine. It was somewhat better made, with odd little tufts of cotton batting stuck on it. It read, Simple shepherds are we, and too sheepish to say, have a happy St. Valentine's Day. Unsigned. Ina Ray gasped. Then she was all over me again. The Johnson brothers? Can it be? As luck would have it, Elmo Leaper and the Johnson brothers were across the hall with Mr. Herkimer. But word that they'd sent Ina Ray Valentine swept our room like a grass fire. Didn't take long. There were only about 12 of us. Carlene Lovejoy looked back in annoyance. Now Ina Ray came to the last Valentine, and I could hardly wait. It really was lovely. A white satin heart, padded like a little pillow, and surrounded by a double row of paper lace neatly pasted on. Hours to make. Ina Ray cradled it in trembling hands to read, To the sweetest little girl in this room, or any room, from R. McN. Oh, Mary Alice! Ina Ray bounced in her desk. She seemed overcome with self-confidence. Word radiated that Royce McNabb had sent Ina Ray Gage a Valentine. Royce was there too, but seemed not to notice. He always brought an Edgar Rice Burroughs book or a Rider Haggard to read before school took up. Word reached Carlene, though. Ina Ray and I watched her vibrate. Then she blew. Out of her desk she switched and stalked back to us. "Let me see that thing." She snatched the satin heart out of Ina Ray's hand, ripping lace. Carlene read the message for herself. Every word burned into her brain. She looked back at Royce McNabb. He sat there with his chin in his hand, reading. Royce was out of her reach. Carlene slammed the valentine in Ina Ray's desk, got down in her face, and howled, "What have you been up to, you trashy little squirt?" A single tear replaced the gleam in Ina Ray's eye. Miss Butler came out of her chair. "Carlene, leave the room." So Carlene had to. Royce looked up as she slumped past him. The back of her neck was valentine red and hot-looking. The door closed behind her. It was 8 o'clock on the nose, so we all got up to give the Pledge of Allegiance. Ina Ray lifted her desktop to sneak peeks at her valentines all morning long, cooing loudly. Down in the basement at noon, when we were eating out of our dinner buckets, all the girls wanted to sit near her, even Irene Stemple. Royce shot baskets by himself, down at the other end. He never really was a team player, though he had a nice hook shot. Not that I knew anything about basketball. Carlene wasn't there. Smart mouth sent you home in those days. Afterward, out at the pump, Ina Ray sidled up to me. "That was fun. Did you see Carlene's face? I can keep the valentines, can't I? You sure dreamed up some swell messages, Mary Alice, especially R. McInnes. They must have took you absolutely days to make." "All in a good cause," I said. Ina Ray had played her role well, too. I'd liked the tear in her eye. Then I went to scrubbing under the pump. My hands had been gummy for days. I thought I'd never get all the paste off of them. Kind of sounds like Mary Alice got a little, playbook from Grandma Dowdle on how to mess with people a little bit. Pulled one over on the girls. February turned out to be my busiest month. I was no sooner through making valentines than Grandma had me rolling out pastry for the tarts, and always from the center out. We spent the weekend before the DART with towels around our middles and our hair tucked up. The kitchen was a white fog of flour. Then on Washington's birthday, the tea was set for 4 o'clock, so I hightailed it home from school. In the kitchen, the tarts were laid out on cookie sheets. Little works of art, each and every one. Grandma was nowhere to be seen. Then, there she stood in the doorway to the front room. Grandma? She seemed to ponder the distance off my right ear. She was posing. Her snow-white hair waved down from a neat center parting and drew back into a bun so tight no hair escaped. Pearls hung in her ears. There were traces of caudy powder in the laps below her chin. I'd never seen her dress. It must have been from the Lane Bryant catalog. It was a maroon wool crepe, with many a tuck taken across the prow. My gaze fell to her waist, where a self belt was holding its own. And could it be? A lacy handkerchief was tucked up a cuff below one large wrist. New shoes peered out from below her skirts. Fine, big black patent leather boots. The tears started in my eyes. I wanted to hold her in that moment forever, framed by that door. "Grandma," I said, "you're beautiful." She waved me away, but she was. A flouncy white party apron she'd made for me hung over a kitchen chair. She tied it around my waist and pointed to a tray of punch cups. No tea appeared to be brewing, but she seemed to want me out of the kitchen while she made the punch. I carried the tray into the front room. It was hot as August in there, and I nearly pitched all the glassware on the rug in surprise. A lady had already arrived and occupied the best chair, and she was no member of the DAR. It was Mrs. Effie Wilcox. Mrs. Wilcox in a hat and an apron, but a nice visiting apron, her eyes and her teeth aimed all over the room. Grandma had set up a table with a white cloth. I put the tray down. Turning, I had the next shock. In the rocker by the stove was another lady, wrapped in shawls and old as the hills. She wasn't DAR either. She looked like she might smoke a corncob pipe. I couldn't tell if Mrs. Wilcox noticed me. You could never tell where she was looking. But the ancient lady was sound asleep because somebody had parked her too near the glowing stove. She was alive, though. You could have heard her breathing all over the house. Back in the kitchen, I said, "Grandma, who's the old party on the other side of the stove?" She turned from a large bowl of brilliant red punch. "That's Aunt May Griswold. The Cowgills brought her to town in the dairy wagon. She don't get out much anymore." "Grandma, how old is she?" "Oh, I don't know," Grandma said. "You'd have to cut off her head and count the rings in her neck." But then a rapping on the front door echoed through the house. "That'll be the DAR." Grandma was cool as a cucumber, as if they often called. When I opened the door, Mrs. Weinbach swept in, followed by Mrs. Brochere, the undertaker's wife, and Mrs. Forrest Pugh, then Mrs. Lutz, the preacher's wife, and then last Mrs. Earl T. Askew. All of them were hatted and corseted, veiled and gloved. They sensed trouble at once. "Oh, tell me I'm wrong," one of them blurted. "Is that Effie Wilcox?" "Howdy," Mrs. Wilcox said, looking them all over at once. They spotted Aunt May Griswold. Her jaw had dropped. She had 2 teeth, and she whistled as she snored. They stared. "She'll be next," said the undertaker's wife. Then they looked up to see Grandma tall in the room, her big fingers laced before her. She looked as good as any of them, better if you ask me. They knew at once she was in charge of the pastry. Of the party. Think about those tarts. "You can throw back your coats," she said in welcome, "or this girl here will take 'em." Mrs. Earl T. Askew was in Persian lamb and wouldn't give me her coat. She longed to flee. They milled in the room, running into each other. Nobody wanted to sit next to Mrs. Wilcox. They noticed the pink silk pillow with the gold fringe Grandma had put out to dress up the sofa. It bore the message, "Souvenir of Starved Rock, Illinois." I brought out kitchen chairs. Mrs. L.J. Widen Bock called the meeting to order, though she was rattled. "We will dispense with our usual order of business," she began, "as we are not alone, but I will call upon Mrs. Lutz to give the invocation." "How about a swig of fruit punch to wet your whistles first?" boomed Grandma. I went to the kitchen for the punch bowl and handed around brimming cups. Mrs. Lutz rose for the invocation, which went on and on. I had time to bring out all the refreshments. When Mrs. Lutz finally ran down, Aunt May Griswold came to sudden life. "Amen, sister," she called out, waking in a crowd. She may have thought she was in church. "Who are you, honey?" Aunt May inquired of Mrs. Weidenbach, who sat too near her. "We are the DAR," Mrs. Weidenbach said, sniffing. "We trace our families back to the American Revolution." "Speak right up to her," Grandma roared from the kitchen door. "She's deaf as a post." "Speak right up to me," Aunt May said. "I'm deaf as a post. But I'm talking about you, honey. Who is you?" "I was Wilhelmina Roach before my marriage," Mrs. Weidenbach spoke stiffly, but she was willing to give her history. "I trace back through my mother to the Crows of Culpeper County, Virginia, and Captain—" "Oh, honey, you don't." Aunt May was wide awake now, bright as a button. The room hung suspended. They hardly noticed when I refilled their punch cups. "You be about what, 56? Aunt May squinted. Mrs. Weidenbach paled and took a quick swallow of punch. "I well remember when the Roaches took you," Aunt May recalled. "It was about 1883, wasn't it? You was a Burdick." All the air went out of the room. "The county took you and your sister away from the Burdicks, as they was all mostly into pokey at the time. You and your sisters was put in separate foster homes. Nobody wanted both of you. I remember like it was yesterday." Aunt May sat back and rocked. "Oh, yes, you're a Burdick. That green-eye, blue-eye trait come into the family later from a lightning rod salesman." The silence was deathly. Mrs. Effie Wilcox rose from her chair. Her hat hung from a single pin. "And the Schultzes took me," she cried out. "They never wanted to tell me who I was. They said it would mark me for life." The DAR ladies fell back. Mrs. Wilcox made a beeline across the room. "You my long-lost sister." She flung out her arms to Mrs. Weidenbach, who flinched. Punch went everywhere, and horror and defeat were written in her face. The afternoon descended from there. Mrs. Askew fled, perhaps to spread the news. The rest circled Mrs. Weidenbach to support her and wall out Mrs. Effie Wilcox. The front room was as hot as the Amazon jungle, and several needed a third cup of punch. They were in tears now, and Mrs. Weidenbach was hysterical. They bore her away out of the front door in a gaggle, their hats over their ears and their veils trailing. None of them walked a straight line, and Mrs. Wilcox wove after them in pursuit. And come to think of it, she and Mrs. Weidenbach had the same coloring, pasty-faced. Different teeth, but Mrs. Weidenbach may not have been her own. Mrs. Wilcox paused at the front door where Grandma was seeing her guests off. "I guess Wilhelmina is broke down with joy at finding me at last," Mrs. Wilcox said. "Very likely," said Grandma, closing the door behind them all. She turned to savor the quiet of the room. Aunt May Griswold had dropped off again. Her jaw gaped. She snored a little whistling, sleepy time tune. Grandma spoke low. "What in Sam Hill are we gonna do with all them tarts?" But we got through them in time. There wasn't a drop of punch left. It had been 1 part strawberry juice and 2 parts Kentucky straight bourbon. I found the empty bottle of Old Turkey later. Grandma. In a sharp break with tradition, Mrs. Dowdle was hostess for this year's DAR Washington's birthday tea. Honored guests were Mrs. Effie Wilcox and Aunt May Griswold. A sudden cold snap has cost the life of a heifer on the Bauman farm and killed a hog. Newsy notes from our communities. The Piatt County Call. I wrote out my latest newsy note and copied it over neatly. As Miss Butler always said, the only real writing is rewriting. Then I dropped it off as usual, down at the post office, on my way to school. So Mary Alice has been the one putting the newsy notes and rewriting them to give the inside scoop on the Washington Day celebration. And it sounds like Mary Alice really is picking up on Grandma's trait of kind of being tricky and sneaky. And I know that last part of the party was kind of confusing. Basically, these people in the DAR group are in that group based on their heritage or who their family members were. So the really snooty Widen Bock, the lady who was the banker's wife, she felt like she had this great past history of her ancestors, and it turns out she's really just a Burdick, a very ordinary person without some big special lineage. So Grandma kind of was able to help show that in the meeting. Tricky once again.